Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A New Majority. My name is Isabel, and today is April 16th, 2025. Today, I wanted to read for you guys, as part of our new segment, the Declaration of Independence. I remember reading parts of the Declaration of Independence in high school, but it's been a very long time, and I don't know if I've ever truly read it in its entirety. And I'm sure that many of you guys probably have either never read it or read it many years ago. And I think it's very important to understand our history, and what better than to read it out for you guys and having to go on and read it for yourselves. So I will read it as follows. This passed Congress on July 4th, 1776. So you guys all know we celebrate July 4th as Independence Day here in the United States, and a lot of us go very crazy that day. And so I will start. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is a right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governs long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms of which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute disposition, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for the future security. Such has been patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws which is wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and forbiddable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at unusual places and uncomfortable and distant from the depository of their public record for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with many firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislator powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obscuring the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenures of their office and the amount of payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislators. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending our own legislators and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of our friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domesticated insurrections amongst us, and it has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers and merciless Indian savages, whose rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these operations, we have petitioned of redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarranted jurisdiction of us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settled here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They have been deaf to the voice of justice and of continuity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good peoples of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from the allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And as the free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with the firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. I'll let you guys sit with that for a second. July 4th, 1776. A parchment signed by revolutionaries declared something that the world had rarely seen. That governments exist not to rule people, but to serve them. That when power becomes tyranny, people not only challenge it, they must. That document, I just read it to you. But let me ask you something. What happens when the truth becomes, we declared self-evident, to start to feel negotiable? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Powerful words. But look around today. Does everything feel equal? Do all voices hold the same weight in our system? Do all people truly feel free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness? In 1776, America said enough to taxation without representation, to a monarch deaf to their needs, to laws imposed without consent. Fast forward to now, and many Americans feel the same frustration: voter suppression, economic inequality, injustice in our legal system. The faces have changed, but cry in the familiar. Are you listening? The Declaration wasn't just independence from Britain, it was a blueprint for accountability. It said, when a government becomes destructive of its people's rights, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. That doesn't mean chaos. It means courage. It means responsibility. It means holding power to its promises. Today, we don't need muskets or midnight rides. We need civic action. We need truth louder than spin. We need people who remember that democracy isn't a spectator sport. Think of the grievances and listen back then. He refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Isn't that what happens when corporate interests override climate legislation? Or when healthcare remains out of reach for millions? It's not ancient history, it's current events. The Declaration was never just a breakup letter with the king, it was a love letter to the idea of freedom, messy, evolving, and unfinished. And that's why it still matters, because every generation inherits its own version of tyranny. And every generation must decide, do we look the other way or do we rise up? Not in war, but in truth, unity, and action. So maybe the question isn't, what does this declaration mean today? Maybe the question is, what do we declare? Up next, my special guest is a queer first generation Mexican American from Southern California. She has a background in Latinx student support, LGBTQ plus activism, and body liberation advocacy. She earned a Gender Studies Bachelor's of Arts and Chicano and Central American Studies Master's from UCLA. Throughout her educational experience, she worked on understanding the experience of fat LGBTQ plus Latinx people and how those intersections impacted their lives in academia, the workforce, and community. Additionally, she taught at UCLA in different community programs across Southern California and worked with the LGBTQ plus community in the San Francisco Bay Area. She has worked for 2 years as the inaugural assistant director for Latinx student support and multicultural programming within the Student Center for Equity and Inclusion. In this position, she has worked to identify the barriers of community development within the Latinx population on campus. Throughout implementing Latinx focused ongoing programs such as dialogues, socials, workshops, and special events, she's helped Latinx students develop a sense of empowerment, cultural affinity, and community. Throughout her multicultural work, she seeks to support multicultural student solidarity and cultural exchange to build capacity for self advocacy and efficiency. She has been an amazing advocate for Latinx students here on campus and just a rock for Latinx students to rely on. And I'm really looking forward to sharing her perspective with you guys. And I want to thank you guys again for tuning in. So, without further ado, here she comes. Thank you guys so much. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to New Majority. I have here with me a very special guest, Dafne Luna. Daphne, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's a little muggy outside, but
It's really gross outside. Yeah. Yeah.
so can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. I'm Daphne Luna. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and ella. And I'm a DEI practitioner in a higher ed institution. Um, and currently, my role is specifically working with Latinx populations.
Mhm.
But I've been doing that on and off for a very long time. Really, most of my career has been working with Latinx populations in different forms. Um, but yeah,
Awesome. So, we're both from the Latinx community,
yeah,
and so I think a lot of people might not know what. Well, first, let's start off with what is Latinx. I think it's a term that a lot of people aren't either too familiar with or kind of only see it in certain spaces. So, do
yeah,
you mind just clarifying what Latinx is?
yeah. That's always a really fun question, um, because it's kind of a hard question, right? Because I think
Yeah.
the question that I get a lot is like, what's the difference between Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine?
Hmm.
Um, and my answer is always based on like context.
Yeah.
So I understand Latinx to be a word that came up After Latino, Latina, Latinao, which is intended to, because Latino is the masculine, um, of Latina. And so over the past couple of like Latinx movements, historically, they started including like, because then you have the feminist movement coming in.
Mhm.
And then you start incorporating queer folks, and they're like, okay, Latina or Latinx. And I think that is partly where Latinx came from. It was one of more of the integration inclusivity of queer folks, especially queer Latinx folks. I also understand it to somehow be related to indigenous languages
Mm.
in Latin America.
Okay.
I don't quote me on that.
Okay.
I may have misread that. But my issue with Latinx is that I consider it a very middle class term. And by middle class, I mean people or Latinx folks who have been in like higher ed or have worked in like institutions that really think about language as a type of value system,
Yeah.
right? So for me, I don't use Latinx in my personal life
Okay.
actually,
Yeah.
which is always fascinating because I have to use it in my role, and that's what I mean when I answer that question. It always has to do
Mm.
with context.
Yeah.
Contextually, in an institution and in systems, I would use Latinx because it is more of a inclusive practice.
Yeah.
Um, there's also Latine, which is the Latin with the e at the end
Mhm.
or the e,
Mhm.
and that's was more created in Spanish-speaking Latin America as a
Mm.
way to combat the X because the X is very American centric and very English centric, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
again, it's context. So what I tend to do, because I think it's fascinating because categorization was really created by the government, right?
Yeah.
And now we all kind of adhere to it and have made it such a big part of our identities, right?
Yeah.
So, what I do is I just kind of reflect the language that other people are using to refer to themselves. So, in my family just says Mexican
Mhm.
or Hispano. And so that's the language I use.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, if I'm in a work setting or a professional setting, I'll use Latinx. If I'm in a more activist, community oriented, a community activism space, I'll use Latine,
Mm.
right? So for me,
Yeah.
it's really just understanding the space and context of how I'm using that word and how it's going to impact those around me.
Yeah.
I think particularly why I really don't strongly like Latinx is a lot of trans women, particularly in Spanish speaking areas and along the border, have spoken out against the X because. And I remember reading this quote and it was so like, oof, okay, I got you. And this woman was talking about how for her, Latinx is an erasure of her gender identity because she worked so hard to become the woman that she knew she was.
Mhm.
And for people not to refer to her as Latina was a slap in the face to all the sacrifices she made. And I was like, oof, I got you, right? And
Yeah.
that's when I realized that this word and this categorization really has to do with context and space. Um, and really, really, the most inclusive thing you can do is just match someone else's language
Yeah.
because you're meeting them where they're at.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. I definitely do think that maybe within the spaces that I'm in, it's kind of like only use Latinx, and if you use like Hispano or Latine or Latina or Latino, you're I mean, I don't want to say like policing language because I don't think that's what it is, but yeah, I do think maybe in the academic space that I'm in,
A
it's like
hundred,
only use Latinx. Don't say Latina,
a
don't say
hundred, yeah,
Latino, don't say Hispanic. So I really appreciate, as someone who works deeply within the community, that you would make those distinctions, and also like just hearing what you're saying, I'm like, okay, yeah, I won't be shy of like using the term Latine or Hispano because again, like that's like what our parents use because that's like where
exactly,
like their culture like back home and their culture
yeah,
here.
and also like the historical moment they came into their categorization, right? They're
Yeah.
a different generation than we are.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, Latinx is very far removed from
Yeah.
what they just learned, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they came either to the United States or whenever they started socializing into general society, that's not a term that existed.
Yeah.
So Hispanic was the first original category created by the American government, right? And so that was kind of the norm for so long until people started challenging that, right?
Mm.
So that's where that's I like to consider that historical component.
Yeah.
Um, because who am I to say that someone else is wrong when I've had so many other privileges that other folks haven't? And that's why I came upon this language that I can use. And now I can use this language strategically in spaces. And I think in academia is one of those where if I'm in a room where I'm with decision makers, I will use Latinx. If I'm in a room with students, I ask them like, what do you want me to say? Like, um, but it's also very strategic.
Yeah.
Language is knowledge and power.
Yeah.
So for me, I really like to leverage that and see how I can strategically use certain words.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So, as someone that works really closely with our community, what would you say is the number one issue facing our community today?
Um, oof, there's so many, obviously.
Yeah.
um, I do think at the moment what's really highlighted is the anti-immigrant sentiment, and specifically the anti-Latino immigrant sentiment, because I do know that our in our current political administration, right, they're making a lot of movements to remove people from this country who
Yeah.
they believe are illegal. I'm like, they're just undocumented. No person is illegal,
Yeah.
and that is also affecting other communities besides Latinos
Yeah.
or Latinx folks, right? However, this has been a long time issue for Latinx folks. Like, Mexico touches the United States. How has it not been an immigration issue forever,
Yeah.
right? And so for me, what's really more pressing is really psychological damage that is happening by this widespread xenophobia against Latino peoples, right?
Yeah.
Um, in my work, I and personally, I have seen it really create a lot of distress, um, a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration, a lot of fear. And those are really strong feelings to constantly have.
Yeah.
Like, our bodies are not made to be in fight or flight all the time. And this is what this general um, climate right now in the United States is creating. And it is so unhealthy. And also, it's having real life impact on people. Like,
Yeah.
we are losing family members, whole families are being displaced, separated, and that takes a toll on everyone, really.
Yeah.
So to me, that is one of the biggest issues because it's so massive right now. It's so in your face and it's so hostile
Yeah.
that it's really hard to ignore. What I don't think we think about long term is the impact, because getting rid of so many Latinx folks, you're basically getting rid of so many ways that they contribute to this country, right?
Yeah.
And we know that immigrants pay a lot of taxes,
Yeah.
particularly undocumented folks are really good about that. They
Yeah.
don't like to talk about that, of course.
Yeah.
So now, look, so if we're going to have a huge economical, it's going to have a huge economical impact if we continue this way. But also, just the fact that we bring so much to this country, and also, to be fair, the United States crossed us. It stole a bunch of Latinx land. So really, we were here for a lot of us were here before the United States came into the picture, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about the whole Southwest that existed way before the United States took it over.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like it's just a fascinating it's just fascinating how people talk about immigration with very little context, very little understanding of the historical movements of land, um, all the wars that happened, the genocide, and everything that's really happened to get us to this place. Because it is so much more complex than like, oh, this person is here illegally.
Yeah.
Okay, well, do you actually have people actually done the research to know how migration works of people?
Yeah.
And I don't think enough people do, because it's usually caused because a superpower has invaded another country for their resources, and peoples follow the resources because they start getting sucked dry from their home, right?
Yeah.
And that's what causes migration. And obviously, United States has done a lot of damage to Latin America, especially Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala, right?
Yeah.
So we know that there has been major migration from those countries, and most recently, I believe Venezuela has been one of those big migration countries too.
Yeah.
um so I'm like, always gives me the chills. It's always awful. I'm just like, y'all broke everything and now y'all are worried about it. Like, y'all fucked it up. So,
Yeah, no, I think it's really important that you mentioned, I guess, the demonization of Latin American people here in the United States, because as we know, like President Trump has made very horrible, disgusting remarks against Latin American people. And when he was becoming president in 2016, he was like, let's bring the Norwegians in. I want Norwegians to come to the United States. Kind of that rhetoric of let's have more white people, but not like people of color come into the space. But Norwegians actually do way worse in the United States than Latin American populations do in the
mm,
United States. And yeah, it's just really interesting to see how much Latinos contribute to many aspects of life, including medicine, law,
oh, 100.
politics, agriculture. We contribute so much in many different ways, and it's very interesting. And we're integral to society.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
integral to having food on the table. So it's just really interesting to see the people that are so fundamental being demonized. But
Yeah.
moving on to what you said about our family members being taken away. So many people live in mixed status families.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in a mixed status family for a very long time, and my extended family mixed status too. And so, like you said, right now we're seeing families being taken apart.
Right, right.
But I do think it's also important to know that many immigrants were also being deported. Most One of the most famous quotes, I guess, or names for President Barack Obama was deporter in chief, because he did
Oh, yeah.
deport a lot of undocumented folk back then. And right now it's repeated, but right now it's more visible, and politicians are more comfortable with saying we need to get them out. And a lot of politicians have campaigns talking about um, just very hateful rhetoric towards Latinos specifically.
Yeah.
And in their campaign videos, they'll have Latinos specifically. And so, what do you think? What do you think right now is something that we have to do in order to protect people in our community? And I guess how much of that responsibility falls on those that do have protected status in the United States?
Hmm. That's a really good question because it really does depend, right? I think for those of us who have protected status and are part of mixed status families, um, it's important that we know our rights and we know their rights,
Yeah,
right? Because, and really that's the biggest one at this moment is know your rights. Because really, in that moment where you having to deal with an ICE agent or someone who's posing to be an ICE agent, right? Because it's also been really confusing. Um, you want to know your rights, what you have, because they actually do not have a lot of access to you unless you give them permission,
yeah,
right? So if you give consent for certain things, then that's going to get you going in a place you don't want to, right? So I think for us, for those of us that have an education and have the language opportunities and really the privileges to know how to look for our rights, it's I think it's up to us to really make that clear, to really talk to people about it, talk to our families about it. I think one of the things that I've had to do that has felt pretty awful but is very necessary is having plans. A lot of times we're doing reactionary things. One of those know your rights aspects is being proactive about a situation that may or may not happen, right? Because the media is really blowing this up like this is happening mass scale, which it is. Don't get me wrong, the numbers are super high,
yeah,
but it's not happening so aggressively at every single moment during the day,
hmm,
right? There are pockets of these attacks on immigrants and immigrant communities, right? And they're very strategic. But we don't know that that's actually going to happen with us or with our families. So let's be proactive and plan. So something that I did was find resources that also help you find your loved ones if they do happen to get deported.
yeah,
The Mexican government has been really proactive in trying to make sure that people stay connected regardless of where they are.
yeah,
But it really is up to us to help make those plans because if we have protected status, it's very unlikely that we'll be deported, even though it has happened. Um, but at least we have the privilege to stay here and use the resources here to make sure that everything else around us is going to stay put, right? And I think that's particularly important when you have like children, because there's a lot of people like people don't really know what to do with children, right? So you have parents who are undocumented, but their children were born here. What happens to them? They'll more likely go into a foster care system, right? And that's not a good place for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it really is important for us to make plans and be proactive so we're ready. It's important for us to know our rights. And if there's ways that we can intervene, especially if we do have that protected status, it's important that we use our voice for those moments, right?
Yeah.
Like I've been seeing videos of people who are documented, like interrupting when these proceedings are happening between other people, right? They're like, you don't have to answer that. You don't have to do that. Don't. They don't have that. Confirm that it has a signature, right? And to me, that's really important because that's where, and I think that's one of the hardest things. Bystander effect is fascinating and awful because it is so easy to be a bystander. So easy. And we are very much taught in this society to be a bystander. But at this moment, being a bystander is probably the most damaging thing you could do to your community. You're
Yeah.
just complicit at that point.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And organizations like the ACLU have provided videos both in Spanish and other language in order to make sure that people know their rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important, like you said, for us to help each other out when we can and when we feel comfortable to interject. Um, but yeah, no, it's just interesting seeing where we're at and how just scary it is.
So scary.
Yeah, I'm from Jersey City, and so
Oh,
it's a sanctuary city. And a lot of people don't know the history of sanctuary cities, but the reason why they are sanctuary cities is so that undocumented folk, when there's a crime, feel comfortable enough to talk to the police in order to help solve crimes. And so
right.
that protection there is to protect the community as a whole. I think a lot of people don't know that or
Right.
don't understand that. But yeah, just a little bit of a historical context there.
Thank
But
you. I didn't know that
yeah.
either.
Oh yeah,
Thank
I
you.
didn't learn that until like recently. But yeah, I will list resources down below on ACLU resources so that you guys can give that out to your family members, friends, or anybody in your community. And so, right now we're in a very interesting political landscape. I think everybody feels very overwhelmed, but I
Yeah.
think at least I'm just going to speak personally for myself, but I feel personally because so many people have been stopped by ICE for seemingly looking undocumented, whatever that means.
Right. Right.
And so, someone that looks Latino and doesn't speak or is not speaking, someone that's just Latino presenting can be targeted by ICE and asked to show identification, and that's just being amplified right now. And so
Mm.
how do you feel about that, and where do you see like your place in society right now with all that going on?
Um, can you clarify your question? Or?
Yeah, so I guess like I feel a little unsafe walking out in public if I don't have my ID because
Mm-hmm.
I'm scared that someone's going to stop me. And recently, as yesterday, there was a man from Maryland who was accidentally sent to a prison in El Salvador, and the White House called it a clerical error, which
Yeah,
obviously is a
they would
it.
do that.
Yeah, but that's insane because they got deported to
Right.
an El Salvadorian prison. Not even like to, I mean, immigrants right now are being deported to Panama, and they're being locked in hotel rooms, not allowed to leave the hotel or leave their room with their
Mm-hmm.
passports getting taken away. And so, as someone who is part of our community, do you feel scared when you go outside? Do you have fear, or what's your relationship with that right now?
Um, to be frank, I'm not afraid.
Okay.
And this is why. Because I am light skinned. So I know that I travel through the world, that I move through spaces and these systems way more differently than people who are darker skinned than I am. And I think and that is where my lighter skin privilege just comes in, right? Although here in Virginia, it's fascinating because I get clocked hella quick. Apparently, I
Mm.
have an accent, which I didn't know I did.
Oh,
So I'm like, oh, cool. So that's been interesting. But regardless, I'm still light skinned, so I'm not likely to get stopped in the way that someone who is dark skinned,
yeah,
right? And I think that's something that we don't always leverage because we do have privileges being light skinned. We are definitely more preferable because we are more aligned to whiteness here in the United States, right?
yeah,
That doesn't negate any of our Latinx experience or our Latinidad. It just is a fact, right? So for me, I'm not scared, but that is a privilege that I do have. But I am scared for my friends who are darker skinned. for my friends who are not Latinx but look Latinx, right? Um, because they're more likely to be targeted than someone like me. I think also I'm short. And I think in general, my demeanor is very, people perceive me as very friendly.
Hmm.
So I'm also not as likely to be targeted, right? Because there's also this very, and it's fascinating talking about gender because this is also one of those moments where we can leverage our gender. I think a lot of times men are more likely to be targeted, darker skinned men, than Latina women who are lighter skinned. So I can use that privilege and my understanding of how people perceive gender and womanhood and leverage that as a tactic for me to navigate through the world safely. And how can I use those things to also support someone else who navigates differently, right?
Yeah.
So I know something that I have done is if I, and this is just something that's come out that I started doing in college because I noticed how, I will say, I think I came into my consciousness a lot later than I liked, but I started noticing how people were treating my darker skinned friends, which I had never noticed before because I grew up in a very Latino community and everyone was Latino, right? Everyone who got treated differently was white because there's such a minority there. So it's just something that didn't click. Um, but when I went to college, it was like diversity everywhere, right? I went to UCLA.
Yeah. Very
Um,
diverse.
so I started, if I went around with people who are darker skinned than I am, or who maybe didn't speak English, I make sure to just stay with them. Because you start noticing when you don't stay with folks who are darker skinned, you start noticing like attendants following them around if you're in
Mhm.
stores, or they just, or people start making assumptions about the fact that maybe you don't speak English or that you're dumb because you look a certain way. So if I am able to accompany someone who may have a harder time navigating a system or a situation than then I would be there because, and I can also help mitigate some of that tension that comes across, right? So for me, it really is just showing up that that's how I've been able to kind of navigate. I lost my train of thought, but I'm not afraid, but a lot of people are, and that's valid. I just know that I'm less likely to be affected by that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think it's interesting seeing how, even though we are all part of the Latinx community, we all present very differently because
Hmm.
it's just such a varied. I mean, there's mestizos, but then there are other people that are more white passing, some people that
Hmm.
are maybe
We are all the
all
colors.
the
We really are all the
yeah.
colors.
No, yeah, my 23andMe was so fascinating.
Ooh.
Yeah, especially because my family's from Ecuador and I have like a lot of ancestry in Mexico, which I didn't
Mm,
know until I took the 23andMe. And I mean, my parents don't know anyone from Mexico, so that's probably like a bunch of generations ago. So
that's so fascinating.
yeah, it's super
Oh, I
fascinating.
love that. I'm like, wait, I want to know more.
I could send you a little
Yes,
screenshot.
please.
Yeah. So again, like a lot of what we're talking about are issues that affect communities, but there's also a lot of issues that affect marginalized communities as a whole.
Right.
And so I think right now people are getting a little more conscious, a little more aware of what's going on. But I think there are still a bunch of people that say, I'm documented, so I don't care what's going on. I'm just trying to survive, which is valid, but I don't want to pay attention to the news because I don't
Hmm.
care. Whatever happens, happens. It's out of my control. And I think when we take that passive stance is when like a bunch of these issues come to the forefront and people are attacking our existence.
Right.
And so what do you say to those people that either don't want to be informed, don't think that anything that's going on applies to them, or just simply don't care?
Hmm. There's a lot of things to say. But I think, or something that I've kind of come to understand, because I will say that I have really great boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and I'm really good at setting them. So I'm actually a little behind in a lot of the news because I only check the news when I'm at work.
Mm.
Because when all this started, so I don't really talk about this a lot, but my dad was deported. So it was like a constant trigger. And I was like, I can't do that. So for me, it's been really trying to figure out, how do I still stay informed? What avenues do I use to stay informed? Because I know a lot of misinformation. is out there, and then what do I do with that information, right? So for me, it's been selectively choosing to not stay connected all the time. And I know that is also privilege I have, because some of these things are not going to personally affect me, but they do affect my loved ones. They do affect my family. They do affect my friends. They do affect my students. They affect some of my coworkers. I know this. So for me to pretend that nothing is wrong or to ignore the fact that these things are happening is a huge, it's just so disrespectful, I think.
Yeah.
There is a way to stay sane. There is a way to find your peace and keep your peace in moments that are so hostile, and that's actually been probably one of the best decisions I've made, to be really strict with how I consume media, because it's made me more effective in my role to be able to advocate, to be able to do research, to be able to create and help people make plans.
Yeah.
If I didn't have the spoons to do that, then I'm not very helpful, right? And regardless if it's not going to affect us because of whatever reason, it's going to affect you regardless, right? And you mentioned that earlier, that this is more of a trickle effect. Like if the world were, if all the Latinos were to disappear from the world, or at least the United States, we would see huge cultural, financial, so many things fall apart.
Yeah.
Like that's just a reality.
Yeah.
So you may not be affected directly. That doesn't mean that you're not going to feel the effect of it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are already. They're seeing the cost of living go up like that, especially food, especially produce, because about 80% of our produce is produced in California. California is very brown, and a lot of the folks who work in the fields, my family included, are brown and are undocumented. So we're already seeing the effects. So it may not. So really, you're just not thinking critically and choosing to stay ignorant at this point.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's disrespectful. I don't think we should be complicit, but there is a balance and there is a way to stay healthy, keep your sanity, not fall apart. It's just really doing working on your own. I don't. I guess what am I trying to say? The self care aspects and what those mean to you to be able to still be part of creating change, right?
Yeah, and thank you so much for that. I definitely have been reading a lot about farm workers not showing up anymore, but we saw this even prior in Florida,
Oh yeah.
when George DeSantis said there had to be some database, and there were a bunch of people that just stopped showing up to construction. And
Yeah.
the
The TikToks were great after.
yeah,
I'm gonna be very honest, they were hilarious.
yeah, and it's oh yeah, they were very funny.
It's like, yeah.
Yeah, but like again, this harmful rhetoric and just again demonization. This isn't too relevant, but I just thought about it, and I think it's important that I share this. But like there's a lot of border crossings, and in Texas, there's this knife blade that just it's attached to buoys, and so if anybody tries to climb it, it's supposed to like cut them. So they're not.
Oh,
So they're
okay.
yeah. It's like to trap them if they do try to come, kind of treating us like animals. But I think it was last year, the year before that, there was a woman and her daughter crossing the border,
Hmm.
and Border Patrol didn't help her, so she ended up drowning. So
Yeah.
there's just a lot there, and again, when you see people like Chrissy Nome, and this is just to say that our community is under attack, and a lot of these things people don't know about, people don't hear about. I mean, I'm very aware because I kind of like seek it out.
Yeah.
Um, but when you see people like Christy Nome
Right.
stand in front of a Salvadorian prison that's known to starve and beat their inmates,
Right.
say, if you come here, we'll find you, we'll track you down, and you're going to end up right here, that's a threat. And it's not just a threat
100.
to people that are undocumented,
Right.
it's a threat to everybody. Because again, we saw that, man
Yeah.
from Maryland get sent there. And there
Right.
have been people that have been detained by ICE that are citizens.
Hmm.
And so there's just a lot that we need to be aware of, and a lot that, even if you think it doesn't directly affect you, you I'm sorry, people can't look at you and say that you're documented. They're not going to know that.
Right. You really can't.
Yeah. And I really appreciate talking about this with you, and I really appreciate getting your perspective. I'm so sorry that your father was deported. my parents were documented for a long time, but now they are documented and now they're citizens. But I was very young when I was aware that they were. I think I was like 11, and we went in front of a judge, and then I
Yeah.
remember like, my dad was like, "Oh, we might have to leave," but I was only 11, so I didn't really know what that meant, and
No,
it
it's
didn't.
so unclear.
Yeah, it didn't seem like
Yeah.
a reality. But one thing I've really found really fascinating is how so many Latinos I have met, we've all kind of like bonded through this like story of migration,
Oh
and
yeah.
a lot of like our experiences being so similar, and a lot of just empathy for each other, because it's something I think that we can all like bond over, and something that we hold deeply to each other, that kind of like forms our identity. And again, it's so interesting seeing how that overlaps with so many other communities.
Mm.
Because I'm so sorry to say this again, I'm from Jersey City, so a lot of my friends are first generation too, and you know, a
Mhm.
lot of them immigrate from Egypt or Pakistan or India or China or Japan, and so it's interesting seeing how this story of migration overlaps with so many communities.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love being part of the Latino community. You know, I grew up watching telenovelas, you know, church on Sunday, and you know, the family parties can go a little crazy.
Yeah, they really are the best, aren't they?
They really are. And so, you know, one thing about my community that I don't like and find really hard is machismo. It seems like it's very ingrained in our community, and I think it probably goes back to the Latine, you know, trying to enfranchise women, Latina. And so, what do you see the harms of machismo, like the results of machismo today? And kind of, you know, since we are first generation here in the United States, I think our relationship with that's a little different. But in what ways do you think that we hold on to it, and in what ways do you think that we separate ourselves from that?
So machismo is really interesting because we're talking about a gender, a system of power based on gender that was created long before either of us were born. This kind of system goes back to, yeah, pre-colonial times, right?
Yeah.
Um, then you're also dealing with something. The other side of the coin for machismo is Marianismo.
I never heard of that.
Yeah, my research is in Chicano
Oh, that's really
studies.
cool.
That's
Yeah.
where my degrees are at. So Marianismo is the opposite of machismo, right? Is that we are trying to have women emulate the Virgen Maria trope, or the
Mm.
Virgen Maria experience. I don't know how to call it right.
Yeah.
But that we're supposed to be good, innocent, quiet, subservient. We're just supposed to behave all the time. We're here to serve because that's what the Virgen does. She's here to serve and nurture and take care of our children, her children, right? All her children, both men and women, right? So Marianismo is just the opposite, less talked about aspect of this power system
Yeah.
that we're referring to. But machismo is one that's more discussed, right? Which we understand to be just really men are in charge of the house, right? They're the head of the house. They're supposed to be always right. We're supposed to ask them for permission for XYZ. Um, yeah, machismo is fascinating. um, what I see is, especially here in the United States,
Hmm.
traditional machista type of dynamics are not really possible because of the fact that we are in such a a really terrible capitalist society, right? Capitalism does not allow us to really stick to those kind of gender norms that are imposed upon us,
Mm.
because at least here in the United States, it's very hard to have one income households. And oftentimes, both the mom, the dad have to work. So then that really disrupts the idea of like who's the head of household.
Mm.
Because, and I think that's just a more modernization aspect that's making gender roles get blurry a little bit, right? Sorry, there's so many things going on in my head, and
Yeah,
I'm
no,
just like,
it was a big question.
I was like, that is such a big question. I think something that I've come to learn, at least in my role is how machismo also negatively impacts men. Um,
Yeah.
we don't really talk about men a lot when we talk about Latino support. It's oftentimes we talk about, obviously, we focus on the women and children experience because women and children are the most marginalized in Latinx communities. We know that, and that's a fact, and that's true. But we also know that if we don't actually tackle the issue of machismo and trying to change those ideologies, it just perpetuates the same cycle of violence, right?
Yeah.
But men are also harmed by machismo because they're not allowed to cry. They're supposed to be tough. They're supposed to be the breadwinners. They're supposed to just always be on it, locked in, right? But how sustainable is that? And now we're coming into the society, and this is, and I don't even think machismo is just like a Latinx thing. Like obviously we're talking about the patriarchy on like a bigger scale, right?
Yeah, of course.
It's just machismo specifically for
Yeah.
um or specifically about Latinx folks. But we see how young men are more right leaning and have these very incel type of ideas. And I do think a lot of that is because the patriarchy has fucked them up so much, to be frank.
Okay.
I That makes me really sad because I don't think it needed to be this way. I think there was definitely a lot of ways that we could have intervened. I don't know how, but I'm sure that there are ways to tackle that
Yeah.
because now we're kind of gone into the opposite of like having some kind of gender equality to having like a huge disparity and also a huge power imbalance.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, sorry, it's a lot to talk
Yeah.
about in that.
No, you gave me a lot. I had no idea about the Marianismo, so
Yeah,
I
that's always
appreciate.
really
No,
fascinating to
yeah,
look into. You should look
yeah.
into
No, I definitely will after this.
it.
But I was reading a paper. The title is multiculturalism bad for women? I hate the title, but it was an interesting piece
Uh-huh.
where they talked about how in Latin America, a lot of men are able to get out of rape charges if they rape someone if they offer to marry them, and it seems like it's a very
That's weird
yeah,
and gross.
it's disgusting. And in Peru specifically, there was a man who was being interviewed by somebody, and he was like, "Yeah, if a woman gets raped, like she's damaged goods. She's no longer pure. She's no longer valuable. So the honorable thing is for the man that raped her to marry her."
Ew.
So it's really interesting seeing how, like, I mean, all over the world, women are being attacked. I know femicide is a
Oh
very
yeah.
big thing in Mexico right now,
Oh yeah.
in all parts of the world. So, yeah, no, when I was reading that, I was just like, wow, like the honorable thing to do is to marry her. Like, can you imagine how
Not just leave her
traumatizing it is?
alone, but
Yeah,
just
yeah, or not even like go to jail,
right.
like marry her. Interesting. So we talked a lot today just about what's going on in our communities, pressing issues, cultural things as well. And I think for people listening that might not be in our community, or even those that are in our community, what would you say is the best way to show solidarity with the Latinx community?
Um, I think it's really just caring about other people. I do feel like with everything happening, it's creating this sense of like, oh, let me take care of myself, bubble, put a little shell on, stay hermit, right?
Yeah.
Um, I need to like save myself in the situation. The reality is we are way more powerful together than we are separate, and we've seen that in a lot of our civil rights movements,
Mm-hmm.
which I
Yeah.
don't think is often talked about. That a lot of civil rights movements and actions and results of that happen because of solidarity work.
Yeah.
And I think what we also don't talk about is that there's so many roles for people in creating change. You just don't have to always be out there picketing or whatever it is that you want to do. There's so many different types of ways you can create change. So for me is really trying to find empathy for other people, trying to connect with other people, asking people how they are, and offering support in different ways, right? So I think what's been really interesting recently is the way that people are showing up for those of us who work in DEI. And though for those of us who are Latinx too, like I've had like non-Latinx friends who I haven't even talked to in a long time. They're like, "Hey, how are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, thanks for asking. I'm not great, but I'm gonna be okay. Maybe we don't know that, right? So, um, for me, it's really just having empathy for others, and making space to create empathy for others because we're not doing that enough, and especially in really hostile, predominantly American, as I like to call spaces, um, we don't really create space for that. There's a lot of competition that's always created. And if we buy into that, we're really just hurting ourselves and the people in our communities and those around us because we really do need each other right now
Yeah.
to move forward and to just be okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for coming on. I just
Yeah.
want to ask one last fun question.
Yeah.
So, if you could go anywhere back in time, just as an observer, you can't change the future, where would you go and why?
Um, I don't think that I would
Mm,
because
would you go to the future?
I also would not.
Oh, okay.
Because one, I don't think we're better off than we were in the past. I think there are moments throughout history where we had more rights, especially we know that we've lost a lot of rights recently, especially those of us who are in the queer community, right? Um, but I've lived some of those moments where I'm like, oh, okay, things are okay right now. Not perfect. Nothing's ever perfect. But I don't think there's a moment in history that I want to revisit because I don't know. I just don't want to see what it was. And then I'm like, oh, was it better? Can I do that? Um, and not being able to participate. I think that's really hard for me. I don't like just observing. I'm like, oh, like I want to go push the button, right? Like, so I wouldn't want to go to the past, and I don't want to go to the future because I want to know how all this plays out, even if
Mm,
it's shit and we're all gonna die and burn or whatever it is, right? I still want to see how it's played out, and I don't want to either give myself hope. I don't want to give myself disappointment. I don't want to put myself in a situation where I can see and have expectations because I think the best thing for me right now is to have minimal expectations and
yeah.
just be like, all right, right now we're just trying to get through. All of us together are just trying to get through. And I hope there is a better future, and I think there is. Um, but I just don't want to know about it. I want to stay curious,
Yeah. Thank you so much for that.
but I would like to see the world through the eyes of a dog.
Oh.
I think they're fascinating, and I'm very
Yeah,
jealous.
I think it'd be really nice because, everybody would just pet you and be like, oh my God, so cute. I
And they
always do
sleep
that.
so comfortably. Have you ever just
Yeah.
watched a dog
Yeah, my dog used to
sleep?
snore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like, how do you sleep like that? Like just so comfy and rested. I'm like,
They don't have
man,
no worries.
that part. I'm
Yeah,
like,
they're
that's why
just,
I think that would be nice. I'm like,
yeah.
what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for coming
Of
on. We had such a
course.
great conversation, and I'm sure my viewers definitely learned a lot. And
I hope so.
yeah, so please stay tuned for next week's episode. And thank you guys so much for tuning in.